everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we are going to go over Chapter 22 from the Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. And this is a really fascinating chapter if you want a deeper dive into Montessori's thoughts behind multi-age classrooms and social development as well as character development. Because we do talk a lot about academics in today's society, and Montessori is really known for these very specific materials. And far too often, what gets left out is the social development that happens in Montessori, the development of character, the development of the will. And so we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to see how the Montessori classroom builds character and builds social development. So let's jump right into page 201. And she's going to start off with talking about developing concentration. And she says the first essential for the child's development is concentration. It lays out the whole basis for his character and social behavior. He must find out how to concentrate, and for this he needs things to concentrate upon. This shows the importance of his surroundings, for no one acting on the child from outside can cause him to concentrate. When I first pointed out the great value of an environment specially adapted in this way to the needs of little children, this idea aroused great interest in architects, artists, and psychologists, some of whom collaborated with me. We started by equipping the child's environment with a little of everything, then left the children to choose the things they preferred. And what I want you to think about here is in Montessori's time, a long time ago, when you thought about the classroom and you thought about even something as simple as furniture, it didn't exist for a child's size. It didn't exist for a child's hands. So not only did she have to furnish the classroom with materials that they could work with, but she also wanted to furnish it with child-size furniture. All of these things were thought about in a new way that hadn't been thought about before. And I know that's really difficult to imagine because it is very common in modern society today to have the child-size equipment. Maria Montessori really began to think about the classroom in an entirely new way that hadn't been thought of before. On pages 201 to 202, she talks about choosing the materials. And she says, seeing that they only took certain things and that the others remain unused, we eliminated the latter. All the things now used in our schools are not just the result of elimination in a few local trials, but in trials made in schools all over the world. So we may truly say that these things have been chosen by the children. At first, we had many toys, but the children always ignored them. There were also many devices for displaying colors, but they chose one type only: the flat, silk-wound spools that we now use everywhere. In every country, this was confirmed. And as you can see to the right, I have included a picture of those color spools that she's talking about. And what is fascinating about this particular material is originally it was made out of silk. Now today it's usually wood or plastic for these color tablets. For some of you who have been following me for a while, you may have heard me tell this story already, but when I was in training, our trainer actually had silk wound color tablets, these spools that she's talking about right here. And these spools were absolutely gorgeous. And we had a very special rule to hold them because they were so fragile, so delicate that we could only hold them by the top and the bottom, and our hands were not allowed to touch the silk. Unfortunately, even though this was a classroom full of adults, too many people touched the silk. And before I even got a chance to work with them, my trainer put them away and said, you know what, I'm sorry, we can't work with these anymore because you're not treating them with respect. And this just gives you an idea of how delicate and fragile these materials originally were for Montessori and for the children that were working with them. And perhaps Montessori's first class of students were much better behaved, unfortunately, than the adults in my training class. So that is the story of those silk wound spools that we now use as the color tablets in our classroom. And it was this process that she used to choose all of the materials. On page 202, she talks about developing virtue through experience. And this is where we're going to get into that character building. And she says, there is only one specimen of each object, and if a piece is in use when another child wants it, the latter, if he is normalized, will wait for it. The child comes to see that he must respect the work of others, not because someone has said he must, but because this is a reality that he meets in his daily experience. From their experiences, another virtue develops in the children, the virtue of patience, which is a kind of denial of impulses by means of inhibition. So the character traits that we call virtues spring up spontaneously. And what I love about this right here is that we create an environment, a reality where a child must develop this virtue because there is no other choice. Now, I have spent many years working in childcare before I came to Montessori, and you know that we have tons of materials and the children are required to share, and there's often more than one of the same material. And so Montessori is really different because we're offering very limited experiences on the materials, and they have to wait if they want to work with something. And so while in childcare, we might be talking a little bit about sharing and watching children fight over materials. In the Montessori classroom, the child simply learns to wait. And I have never had the experience where children don't get their lessons. All the children seem to have time to work with the materials they want. I've never seen them lacking for working with the lessons they need. And there are a few materials that we do put on the shelf, maybe the stamp game, where we have more than one. Sometimes we do need more than one material, but for the most part, the way we organize our environment, the way we organize our classroom, is a reality for the child that causes them naturally to develop virtues such as patience. On page 203, she talks about how experience is the real teacher. And she says, we cannot teach this kind of morality to children of 3, but experience can. And because in other conditions, normalization is prevented so that people the world over see children fighting for what they want, the fact that our children waited struck them as all the more impressive. It was the environment we had prepared carefully and the freedom they found in it. Under these conditions, qualities formerly unknown in children of 3 to 6 were able to show themselves. And so we can see these virtues, these characters inside the Montessori environment, and it doesn't happen a lot in other environments. It didn't happen as much for me in childcare. Children were always fighting over the same materials. They weren't learning to take turns and wait. And we can say whatever we want as an adult, but if we limit the experience to one material per child, they have no choice but to wait. And in that lesson of waiting, we can go over to our students and we can make a plan and say, I understand you want to work with this material, but now we have to make a plan about how you're going to wait. What other materials in this room do you need to work with today before you can get the one that you really want? How are we going to wait? And those are the conversations that we will have with our students. On page 203, she talks about interfering with development, and she says, when adults interfere in this first stage of preparation for social life, they nearly always make mistakes. Children feel irritated if we intervene, and they will find a way if left to themselves. The teacher instead usually intervenes, but her solution differs from that of the children, and this disturbs the harmony of the group. Apart from exceptional cases, we ought to leave such problems to the children. Teachers who use direct methods cannot understand how social behavior is fostered in a Montessori school. They think it offers scholastic material, but not social material. The only social life that children get in ordinary schools is during playtime or on excursions. Ours lives always in an active community. And so right here, we're talking about how that Montessori environment is alive. We're not forcing kids to sit in desks. We are setting up the environment in a way that has a reality that children have to behave in certain ways. And because of that, our children are always interacting with each other. The older are giving lessons to the younger ones. They're learning to wait for the material to go back on the shelf. Each child is learning to finish an entire work cycle. They take something off the shelf, they do the work properly, they put it back on the shelf so it's ready for the next person. And this is how it works in real life, right? If we're looking at childcare, well, children just throw their toys all around and maybe they share, maybe they fight over it, and then they leave it on the floor. And at the end of the day, we'll do this pickup time. We have to be responsible for ourselves in every stage of our work as an adult. And so if we're talking about social development and how the classroom works, Montessori is actually more accurate to the real life world than something like childcare is. And on page 204, she talks about multi-age classrooms. She says the charm of social life is in the number of different types that one meets. Nothing is duller than a home for aged. To segregate by age is one of the cruelest and most inhumane things one can do, and this is equally true for children. Our schools show that children of different ages help one another. The younger ones see what the older ones are doing and ask for explanations. These are readily given, and the instruction is really valuable, for the mind of a 5-year-old is so much nearer than ours to the mind of a 3-year-old. And if I'm going to be honest about this, when I worked in childcare, I did not like multi-age classrooms. I didn't understand how it could work, how to get all those lessons done. How do I prepare all these children for kindergarten at different ages? And that's because of the way the environment is prepared. Montessori prepares the environment differently. And we foster leadership. We foster opportunities for older students to give lessons to younger students. And what I love the most about the multi-age classrooms is that as a guide, as a teacher, you are not in their face all the time. When I worked in childcare, you were always expected to be in their face. You were always supposed to be engaged with the child at all times. You had to have their attention at all times. You were the center of their attention. And if you weren't, you were going to get reprimanded. You were going to get in trouble. That's not proper in early childhood. But in Montessori, the more that the adult can take a step back and allow that classroom to function on its own, the better the environment will be. So if you can present a lesson and then back away and just allow the children to work, and to engage with one another, and you don't have to intervene, you shouldn't. And that's how we get the adults away from being the center of attention in children's education. We want the work and the social development to be what has taken place. We don't want the adult to be the center of their world in education. And just a little note, because I find this fascinating. She did talk about a home for the aged, and there is a Montessori for aging and dementia. I'm not sure if most of you are aware of this, but there is a training for Montessori for seniors. And it's something I've always thought about doing. It's not something I've taken any classes on, but it's on my list of things to do. I would love to be able to take this course, so maybe someday I will, and if I do, I will let you know. But if anybody is interested in doing Montessori for aging and dementia, Brush Development Company is where that training is. So you can go there and you can look them up and you can look into this training if it's something you're interested in. On page 205, she talks about building a community. And she says there are many things which no teacher can convey to a child of 3, but a child of 5 can do it with the utmost ease. There is between them a natural mental osmosis. All the older ones become heroes and teachers, and the tiniest are their admirers. The only thing they used to say in schools of the old kind was, so and so has won first prize, or that boy has scored 0. True fellow feeling does not develop in such a fashion. Yet this is the age in which social and antisocial qualities are going to be evolved according to the nature of the child's surroundings. This is their point of origin. And so when we're talking about this building of a community, this multi-age group, the younger children are admiring the older children. The older children, while they have their own work to do, are very much the leaders. And when one person does something great, all of them celebrate. And that is the community that we're building. We're not building a community of competition, but admiration. Because if one person succeeds, everyone will be able to succeed. On page 205, she talks further about how the child is a teacher in the Montessori classroom. And she says, people sometimes fear that if a child of 5 gives lessons, this will hold him back in his own progress. But in the first place, he does not give lessons all the time, and his freedom is respected. Secondly, teaching helps him to understand what he knows even better than before. He has to analyze and rearrange his little store of knowledge before he can pass it on. So his sacrifice does not go unrewarded. On page 206, she talks about freedom in the environment, and this is a tricky one because some teachers interpret freedom as do whatever you want, but in the Montessori classroom, we have freedom with limits. So on page 206, she says, our dividing walls are only waist-high partitions. and there is always easy access from one classroom to the next. Children are free to pass to and fro between classrooms. If a child of 3 goes into the room for 7s, 8s, and 9s, he does not stay there long because he soon sees that it contains nothing useful to him. There are demarcations, but no separations, and all the groups can intercommunicate. Each has its appointed place, but it is not isolated. One can always go for an intellectual walk. Freedom like this enables the observer to note the limits of understanding at each age. In fact, this was how we came to realize that children of 8 or 9 could understand the square root operations, which they saw being done by children of 12 to 14. And I find this very interesting because I've always encouraged the Montessori schools to be more flexible with children going between classrooms. I know that's a really difficult thing to do, but I always kept my classroom open so that older students could come visit younger students and younger students could have opportunities to go into older classrooms. Now, we have full classrooms with walls. We don't have waist-high partitions, right? And so we are a lot more isolated in our modern society. But I do want to encourage people to think outside of the box, that your classroom is not supposed to feel isolated or limited, and that children should have that curiosity to see what the older students are working on. And this should also encourage the older students to be leaders, to show off what they know and what they can do. On page 206, she talks about building leadership, and she says, "Our schools are alive. To understand what the older ones are doing fills the little ones with enthusiasm. The older ones are happy to be able to teach what they know. There are no inferiority complexes, but everyone achieves a healthy normality through the mutual exchange of spiritual energy." Now, of course, modern society, we have a lot of abnormality in our classrooms, and there's a lot of reasons why for it, and we're not going to go into that in this video. But I know there are a lot of teachers struggling to have a normalized environment, a normalized classroom, and there are a lot of things that go into to help or hinder a classroom from being normalized. But one thing we need to build is our older students. And one school I visited, there was no leadership going on in the classroom. And finally, I asked the teacher one time, I said, "How long have you had the older students in this classroom? How long have they been there?" And it turns out that every single year, the school seemed to reboot its programs, reorganize its classrooms. And so those children never had a normal 3-year cycle. There was no leadership being built up because the school kept rebooting its ideas. And so that stability wasn't there in the classroom, and you could see it. The oldest students were completely deviated. The younger ones were going about the classroom in a chaotic manner. And there was no love or community built between the students. And so you can really see this in environments. And it really all of a sudden will hit you when there is an environment that where maybe the teacher is too heavy-handed on controlling all the students, or maybe there hasn't been leadership built up through 3 years. You're going to start seeing those deviations and how the community doesn't come together when the adult has too big of a role in the classroom and the older students have too small of a role. So we need to make sure and have that 3-year cycle and build those leaders. And on page 207, we have a very important concept from AMI Montessori training, and that is called the law of maximum effort. And in case you don't know, children follow this law. Adults follow the law of minimum effort. So you're going to learn that in AMI Montessori training. That's very important. The law of maximum effort. Remember that that is the law that children follow. And she says, children, as we have said, solve their own problems. But we have not yet explained how. If we watch them without interfering, we see something apparently very strange. This is that they do not help one another as we do. This is very illuminating because it means they respect intuitively the essential need of childhood, which is to not be helped unnecessarily. I believe the child has an unconscious memory of his own early wish and deeply felt need to make the maximum effort. And that is why he does not help others when his help would be an obstacle. And that is something I really had to learn when I came to Montessori, how not to interfere, how not to be an obstacle to the child, because all my early childhood training taught me to be the obstacle, to be the center of attention, to help unnecessarily. And that's not what we want to do. We want to allow opportunities for children to solve their own problems. And if they can't, we want a chance for the community, the other children, to help solve that problem. Only when that has failed should we be intervening. Or if we see them being disruptive, disrespectful, or destructive, right? If the 3Ds happen, then we do intervene. But up until that moment, we want to let this play out. On page 208, she talks about mistakes, and she says, with our children, if there is a mishap, like the breaking of a vase, the child who has dropped it is often desperate. He takes no pleasure in breaking things and feels ashamed of himself for not being able to carry it safely. The grown-up's reaction is to shout. But what do our children do? They all run to help. They have an instinct to help the weak, encouraging and comforting them. And this is really an instinct for social progress. And just a little story behind that, I was working in toddlers one year, and I had a sub one day, and one of our little guys was doing dishwashing. And in dishwashing, they have to pour a big tub of water into a bucket when they're done. Well, this adult is not used to working in a Montessori classroom. They were a parent at the school. They weren't a Montessori teacher. So this sub was on the other side of the room working with a child or monitoring the classroom, and all of a sudden she hears the sound of water splashing. And from across the room, I hear her yell, "No!" because she thought that the child was just dumping water onto the floor. And unfortunately, that interrupted the child. Now, this child had a really difficult time finding work and concentrating. So the fact that he was doing the dishes and he was really into this lesson, he was doing it perfectly. He was pouring perfectly. It was the moment we had all been waiting for this child. And then there was an adult on the other side of the room yelling no. And she meant well, but it does go to show you that our instincts are very different. Our natural instincts, and we have to fight them as adults. We have to fight these instincts and allow the child to work. And sometimes we don't realize their capability or their potential. So that is something that we have to learn when we are approaching a Montessori classroom, is children have a lot more potential than we give them credit, and they have a lot more ability to solve their problems than we give them credit for, and other children are really helpful. So when it comes to that broken vase, what do we want to see? We want to see them helping each other. We want to give our older students the tools and the knowledge and the capability to help them clean up that mess. And someday, those younger children, as they watch, will grow up to do the same thing for other younger children. And lastly, on page 209, she talks about building a community of admiration. And she says something very uncommon can be seen in our schools. It is admiration for the best. Not only are these children free from envy, but anything well done arouses their enthusiastic praise. The first word to be written by one of them brought a great outburst of joy and laughter. Everyone looked admiringly at the writer, and thus they felt moved to follow his examples. The achievement of one started off the whole group. There is among children an evident sense of community. This rests on the noblest feelings and creates unity in the group. And that's really what we want out of our social development. That's what we want to see in Montessori. We want to see children admiring each other, and one child's success becomes another child's success. For when one succeeds, they pull everyone else up with them. So that's all I have for you today. This was chapter 22 on social development. Now, this was not the full chapter. It was just some of my favorite quotes from the chapter. I would highly encourage you to go and read the book, read the entire book and the entire chapter on your own. I will be happy to answer any questions or comments. I'll also put any extra resources I can think of in the comments section down below for you. And with that being said, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.